All advice given is for general information purposes. All legal cases are different, and you should seek the advice of your own attorney before acting or making decisions. No attorney-client privilege applies to communications on this show, and no attorney-client relationship is created by calling or writing in. Attorney Rominger practices only in Pennsylvania and maintains his primary office in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Hey, good afternoon. Carl Rominger here, 540-0580, answering your legal questions at 2 p.m. Going to be joined by guest here in studio, David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. I'm going to talk about how a forensic accountant can help in investigations, what their role is, how they help law firms, get into some interesting things there. It involves a lot of financial data, obviously. So save your questions for him for that hour. But right now, if you've got a legal question, and of course we'll take those both hours as well, 540-0580. We'll talk about whatever you want to know, whatever that might be. You know, an apartment issue, a right-of-way issue. What's the difference between an easement for the person versus an easement that runs with the land, et cetera, et cetera. 540-0580. Shebecca, you're on the air.
Yes, hi. I moved into an apartment, and even though they knew in 35 days in advance, and the apartment was filthy nasty. You couldn't even you wouldn't want to stay in it. So I went on and took 2 days to clean it, but I didn't know that the apartment was full of bed bugs. Yeah. But due to the issue that by me being on Section 8, they should have never approved the apartment just of the filthiness. And I have pictures. I took pictures of this, of the filthiness of it. But even though I signed the lease on December the 8th, the day is and I moved in December the 9th, not knowing the bed bugs, till I happened to lay down 2 days later in here because I couldn't sleep because the place was too filthy for me to sleep in. Mm-hmm. The bed bugs are still here. I had to have an orchid man come, even though I'm on a fixed income because I'm disabled, mentally challenged, as well as physically that I'm disabled. And the landlord comes to me yesterday talking about he signed a lease with the HUD to make me stay here to November 13th. After they agreed to let me go ahead and move out of here, he comes to me on the 4th stating that I'll make an offer to you the 4th of January. He said, I will pay your your deposit to move and give you your deposit back. When I called the Orkin people and they showed right here that the bugs are still here, and I've been living here all this time. Mm-hmm. I'm a diabetic. I've been ate up from my face all the way down to my ankle. They refused to pay for the medication.
Okay.
And the bugs are still here. He has done nothing to it. So all of my things are lost.
When are you getting out of there?
Well, I'm gonna tell you what they try to do to me. They try to force me. I had this on a text. He said he's not. He's gonna come to me and tell me he signed the contract, but he's gonna tell me Thursday. Monday he told me he was gonna give my money back. When Tuesday came, he said he wasn't giving me anything back.
But if you're on Section 8, the county housing department should be mediating this, right? Have you talked with them?
But you know what? I'm gonna tell you this. When I told them I was taking it above their head, because the landlord took and said, "No, you're going to stay here till November," and I told him, "No, I'm not going to stay here till November." And you know that these bugs are still here. How can Section 8 allow him to sign a HUD lease?
Well, wait, slow down.
Okay.
What are the county assistance people telling you?
Well, when he left my apartment yesterday, okay, I told him no, I was not staying here, and he took and said he'd think about the lease. So I go directly to Section 8. Section 8's going to say that they have to negotiate with him to get me out of the lease. Why would y'all let him sign a HUD lease? And y'all know the bug problem is still remaining. The Orkin man took and confirmed it last Friday when he was here, and the bugs are still here. So imagine what I'm going through, and due to my disability.
You have two options. One is you can certainly break the lease. I mean, obviously you're constructively evicted, and then you got to move somewhere. Your other option is to keep working with the Section 8 people and let them resolve the problem.
Sir, I'm gonna say this to you: the mental stress that this has taken me through.
Right,
I don't want to stay here.
Okay, well, then you're allowed to break the lease if somebody's constructively evicted you by not taking care of a pest problem, for instance. So you would be free to leave, and then you can sue for your damages to get your money back and your rent back. But there's no way to proactively do that.
Okay, the landlord came to me. He said he was not going to pay thousands of dollars. He had his maintenance people come here to spray, which he did not get rid of.
But that's a side issue. My point is you got two options.
Right.
One is move out and then sue for damages. The other is to stay and continue to work through the Section 8 process.
Can I be forced to stay here? Can they force me to stay
Well, nobody
here?
can force you to stay there, but you got to have somewhere else to go, right?
I do have an apartment that was approved for me. I have all that set up for me to move out of here on the 1st.
Right. So put that stuff together and get out of there, but you might need to stay somewhere in the meantime. All right, Rebecca, that's the best I can tell you. 540-0580. Lee, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Hey, I have a follow-up question what you were talking about last week.
Yeah.
A young fella called in and asked about, being stopped by the police, and you were saying that you don't have to answer those questions and so forth. Okay, and then you cited the the Fourth Amendment and the 10th and so forth. And all right, but what happens if the cop then says, okay, I'll tell you what, if that's the way you want to roll, how about if I just call in and get the drug-sniffing dogs out here?
Mm-hmm.
All right, then what's your option?
I say, well, am I free to leave? Depends what's he say.
So that would be the question to him then.
Am I free to leave? And if he says no, then he has to articulate a basis to keep me there. So later the judge is going to say, well, what was your basis? So I actually had a guy who had 7 pounds of marijuana in his trunk, and he told him that they could search his car but not the trunk of his car. And they told him that made them suspicious and they were going to get a drug-sniffing dog out there, which they did. And they lost because he was free to leave, and he didn't have to give consent to search the trunk.
So what would happen?
So he walked off 7 pounds of marijuana. No guilty there.
All right. So the policeman says, "Yeah, you're free to leave." So then you get in your car.
You leave.
And then what? He comes after you and then stops.
If he says you're free to leave, you're free to leave.
Oh, okay.
He's got to have reasonable suspicion to detain you for what's called a Terry stop, meaning he's got to articulate something. So, there's a suspicion sometimes. Like, let me give you an example. We get a car pulled over, and it's a nice car, and it's driven by a young Hispanic male, and then the police claim that the reason they stopped it was there was an air freshener in the car, and drug dealers use air fresheners. And if you think I'm making this case up, I'm not. And that was their basis for detaining this guy. And, of course, the judge is saying, and he wrote in his opinion that he thought perhaps it had more to do with the race of the individual and the fact that it was a New York license plate and it was a BMW than it had anything to do with anything else. And certainly an air freshener does not mean you're a drug dealer. But according to the Pennsylvania State Police in that particular case, it was a sign of drug dealing. Oh. Welcome to the world of court. Oh, and that's the one where they also lost the entire video and audio tape of the thing in some kind of technical glitch. All 45 minutes of it.
So even though he may have the authority to call in the drug-sniffing dog.
Well, you can get a drug-sniffing dog, but now here's the question. If he smells marijuana, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's the most common thing we hear. I smelled marijuana. That gives him a basis to detain you further.
Well, because you watch these shows and they ask you, just about the time they're ready to leave, they turn around and they come back. Oh, by the way, you don't have any weapons or anything in the car, do you?
Yeah, and you know what I said to the last state police officer that asked me that? I said, I don't answer questions about weapons for Pennsylvania state police officers. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
And you know what he said? Okay. Because he knows that's the rule.
Yeah.
So remember this. Here's your lesson here. Don't cooperate. Give him your name. Give him your address. Give him your license. When the guy walks up to the car and asks you, do you know why I pulled you over? Go ahead and say speeding so you can use that as a confession later. Or just say, I'm not sure why you pulled me over, because you don't know why he pulled you over. I mean, you know what you were doing, but you don't know if that's the reason he pulled you over. So an honest answer is, I don't know why you pulled me over. Well, you were speeding. Oh, I was speeding? I guess I was. No, I wouldn't say that either. I'd just say, oh, is that why you pulled me over then? Okay, interesting. Then let them write up your ticket. Be friendly about it. If they want to go farther and they ask you if you have a firearm, I decline to answer. If they ask me if I've been drinking, I decline to answer. If they ask me what's in the trunk, I decline to answer. If they ask me what my race or national origin is, or if I'm a legal immigrant or not, I refuse to answer. And they know the rules, and they'll respect that.
Okay.
But most people think, oh, if I tell them no, then that's going to create a bigger problem. So here's a famous police officer line. Listen, have you been drinking? And you go, well, I don't want to answer that. Well, it's very important that you answer my questions. And you're like, well, I don't really want to answer that. I don't think I have to. Do you want this to go down the hard way or the easy way? You want to make it go down the hard way? And then a lot of people go, oh, I'm in some kind of trouble because I'm not answering.
Right.
He never said that, did he?
No, he didn't.
Uh-huh. That's right. And so if you go on my Facebook page, you can watch the video of me pulled over by the Susquehanna Township Police when they try something similar.
Oh, okay. I'll do that.
It's a little hard to hear the sound on it, but you'll get the gist of it.
Oh, very good.
All right, my friend.
I appreciate it very much.
Right.
I'm sure everybody else just got educated on that.
I'm hoping.
Thank
you. 540-0580. See you after the break. Okay, welcome back. I've been told, if you watch that video on Facebook, that the only thing I appear guilty of is some kind of fashion crime. Anyhow, I was in my golf shorts. I don't understand it. 540-0580. And remember, at 2 o'clock, we're going to have David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. So if you're a lawyer, a law firm, or a company or business, and you've ever said, I need to audit these books or figure out who did what to who or when to how, we'll talk about that at 2 o'clock. Charles.
Yes.
What's going on?
How you doing?
Good.
I'm glad to meet you, sir.
Good. What question you got for me?
Is just what you got off the phone with speaking, because I'm in the same predicament. But the only thing is, what was going on, I made a left-hand turn on Progress Avenue.
Okay.
And as soon as I made that left-hand turn, he said I went out in front of, traffic before the other people left. And then he pulled me over in the parking lot, in the Wendy's parking lot. Then he talked to me and ran my plate and everything. Then he came back to me and told me to bring my insurance was invalid, bring my insurance, card down. And I told him my insurance has always been up to date and has never been invalid. Never.
Right.
So what happened was, a week or two goes by, then I get a letter in the mail from the district justice out there on Progress Avenue talking about I owe $120. Then later on I get another letter for $20 and all this stuff, $150 and all that. It just kept going up and up. Then they sent something to PennDOT to saying something about I didn't have no insurance. I can always verify that I've always had car insurance.
Right.
So I just, want to know what I could do about it.
Did you get a date for did they file a ticket against you for not having insurance?
Yeah, they filed a ticket, but I got everything.
So what you do is you take your proof that shows you have insurance to the district judge's office for the hearing, and it should be dismissed.
All right, well, I'll take your, even go to the insurance company and get a letter where they can tell them that I've always had car insurance.
Yeah, that
sounds good.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it. And the judge will usually look at that and say, well, then why did the officer think you didn't? And you can say, I don't know, because it's right here, and Judge, and this is my insurance guy, and if you want to call him, he said, feel free to call him, and he'll tell you I've been here the whole time.
That sounds good. That sounds good to me.
All right.
But I'm going to do that, sir.
All right, let me know how it turns out.
All right, thank you.
All right, we're here every Saturday from 1 to 3.
Trust me, if I can't get resolved this, I'll be sitting in your office.
Well, and it's important with the insurance issue because they will eventually issue a license suspension on you if you're convicted of it.
Well, they're trying to right now, so I got to go out there and take care of this Monday.
All right, my friend. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
540-0580. Mark, you're on the air.
Hey, Carl, it's Mark. How are you?
Good.
Hey, so about 2 years ago, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. I borrowed a friend of mine's vehicle, was bringing it back to his house, wasn't breaking any traffic laws or whatnot. Well, he was a dealer for an automobile, an auto car lot or whatnot, and he took his dealer tag off because I guess there's a black market for the dealer tags, and he sat in the back seat. Well, me getting into a car, it's not like you always look to see if the dealer's, if your license plate tag's on. So I get in the car. Police officer stops me, state trooper, comes up to the vehicle, opens the door right away, pulls me out of the vehicle. I had my concealed permit, a gun on me, which I'm permitted to have through this county, and he basically said, put me in cuffs right away because, of course, he thought it was a stolen car. I didn't have any tags on it. Ripped my gun right off of me, then began to question me or whatnot, ran my gun, the serial numbers, I guess the gun dealership where I bought it mixed, inverted two of the numbers. Next thing you know, I'm down at the state police barracks. He's telling me I'm getting the book slammed at me. Long story short, I get 3 traffic citations, no gun citations, for operating a vehicle that's unregistered because it didn't have the tag on it, and it didn't have insurance because it didn't have the tag on it, and for a police investigation. Well, I take it to court, I fight it because I'm saying, hey, the car is technically registered in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania just because it didn't have the tag on it, and I didn't know the tag was sitting in the back seat. It still has insurance because it's a floating policy. And so then he even said, you know what, just throw the police investigation citation out anyways. District magistrate found me guilty of all three anyways, even though the cop forfeited the one. And so my question is, when a police officer approaches the vehicle, do you have to notify them that you do have a handgun or a firearm in the vehicle?
No, you do not. And there's always mixed emotions on that one. Some people think you should, as a matter of courtesy. Others of us think that, unfortunately, the government then sometimes likes to secure the weapon. And once they secure the weapon, then they write the numbers down and they run things on it, and then they don't want to always give it back. And it creates a whole issue. We've also learned and had cases where police have seized guns where there really isn't a gun crime going on, and you find out it's sent to the gun lab for ballistics so that they can, quote, register your ballistics, which they really shouldn't be doing, we don't think. But anyhow, that causes me, for instance, like I said earlier, to decline to mention whether I have a handgun or not. Although my favorite thing to do is to hand my concealed carry permit with my license to the officer, so he's aware that I have a concealed carry permit, which is probably giving a strong suspicion there's a gun in the car. But I think that's as far as I like to go. And the point being is, if they want you to get out of the car, or if the gun's like a lot of times my Glock, right? The butt of the Glock will be sticking out of the in between the seats, let's say.
Sure.
And if they're paying attention, they should be able to see it. But I would, in that case, if it's visible like that, I'm going to mention it to the officer, because I don't want to start to get up to get out or something and have him suddenly realize it's there and think that somehow it wasn't there before, right?
Sure.
So I think you got to use your best judgment. If the gun's plainly visible, or it's likely to flop out of your lap when you stand up, or it's hanging off your hip, you probably should mention it. If it's in your glove box or under the seat or safely stowed away, I wouldn't mention it. But there's no law in Pennsylvania that compels you to mention it.
Okay. But and one more follow-up question. In Pennsylvania, as soon as you get in the car with the gun loaded, a handgun, it's considered concealed, and that's when you need a permit, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But if you want to use the handgun, you have to have it secured separately from ammunition in a wrapped container of some sort. So if you put it in a box or something and transport it to the range, we always tell people, if you're not a concealed carry permit person, the best thing to do is have the gun unloaded, the magazine out, in the trunk of your car, separate from the ammunition.
Okay.
That way there's no questions. That's the same for interstate travel as well.
Okay. But technically, by law, I do not need to notify the police officer that I do have a gun on me.
No, you do not.
But it would be in my best interest if I'm getting out of the vehicle, hey, officer, I do have a gun on me.
Especially if it's strapped to you. If it's just in the glove box, I wouldn't mention it still.
Okay.
That's
but if
me.
It's strapped to me.
If it's strapped to you, I think you want to let him know so that he doesn't become surprised by the weapon. Listen, how do most bear attacks happen, right? Bears don't really want to eat humans, but they get surprised. You walk up on the bear, or the bear walks up on you, and there's a mix-up of communication. It's the same idea with a firearm.
Sure. But a police officer can take the gun off of me, right?
As part of a Terry stop, if he has an independent belief that you have a weapon, he may stop and frisk you to secure it. But if it's in plain sight, obviously, then he can frisk you or secure it for officer safety purposes if he has a valid reason to detain you.
Okay.
So interestingly, if he had no reason to detain you or question you.
Sure, like the license plate was missing.
Right, so he has a reasonable, articulable basis to believe that criminal activity may be afoot. So he may conduct a Terry stop for purposes of determining whether his suspicion is warranted or not.
Okay. And one more question, Carl. I'm sorry to hold you up.
No.
Is it illegal for me to have my gun on me and go over the Pennsylvania line like into Maryland or New Jersey?
Both of those states have separate and independent laws. I don't know them by heart, but my understanding is it's really bad to take your handgun into New Jersey especially, and Maryland as well, if you do not have a license in that state and you're not complying with their laws.
Okay. So
you may drive through those states on your way to another state with the gun secured in the trunk, et cetera, and moving in interstate commerce, and they can't really do anything to you. But when we had the gun trust guy on, the gun trust lawyer from theguntrustlawyer.com about a month back, he pointed out that here's the problem. What does it mean to travel through the state? Are you just going across the interstate through the state? Are you stopping and staying in a hotel room for the night? Or does your wife convince you, well, why don't we stop for the weekend in Schenectady and hang out, And so if you stay over an extra day, are you really just passing through, or did you travel to that state?
Sure. Okay. Well,
right.
Very good. Keep up the good work, brother. You rock.
Thank you, brother. 540-0580. Dennis, you're on the air. Hey, Dennis.
Yes, Carl.
Yep.
I have two basically statements. One, a few years ago, I was a registered weapon owner. My weapon was stolen. I did have a carry permit. Now, with me having a carry permit and the weapon was in my car, I went to the range before work, shooting and everything. Then I drove home. And once I got home, I just went into bed. I left my weapon in my car. I come back out a little while later when my fiance was headed to work because she was going to take my car, and my car was broken into and it was stolen.
Okay.
Well, once I called the police, I called them right away. They came and, they looked at the situation and everything. They started questioning me about, well, was the weapon registered? Was it legit and everything else? And, of course, it was. They never got anybody down to do any type of fingerprints. And the thing about it, I had just cleaned my car that day, and there were fingerprints on two areas on the truck where they climbed up in, and because they busted out the back window of the truck.
Gotcha.
And reached in. So there were two places where there were handprints at, and I told them, hey, there's handprints up here, so on and so forth. They never sent anybody out to do take fingerprints or anything. This is one of the ways that criminals get weapons.
Right, and that's actually the main way that criminals get weapons is they steal them, or quite interestingly, they've never actually committed a crime or had a mental health problem previously, which allows them to buy them as well. But truly, most prohibited people that are prohibited to own who end up with weapons get them either stolen or they're laundered through some kind of network where there's a lot of the things where the girlfriends go in because the girlfriends won't have the felony drug records.
Right.
And they'll send, and I've been told by some of the firearms guys that work at various major outlets like, Bass Pros and Gander Mountain and stuff, you can almost sniff them out, and they will, if they're suspicious and they have any reason to believe, they call the police, and then they start a straw man investigation, and they, you get a 19-year-old or a 21-year-old girl who's got no idea. You can tell after you try to talk to them about the firearms that they have no idea except they've been told what to buy, and they have no lingo. They don't have any idea. You're going to take a target shooting, and they can't explain. They get suspicious, and they're able to ferret them out fairly quickly. So the best way is still just to steal it.
Right. Now, my other question.
All right, I got to go to break, and we'll take your other question on the other side.
Okay, no problem.
Hold on. 540-0580. Oh, welcome back. Carl Robinger here. During the break, I was working on my plan of world domination of the pickle market. We'll talk more about that in future shows. All right, Dennis, back to your weapons problem. What's your second question?
Okay, my second question is, now I'm a corrections officer here in the state of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And a few years ago, I ended up getting a DUI in 2003. 2004, my weapons carry permit expired.
Okay.
Well, when I went to go back to get it renewed, I was denied because I had a DUI. And I got all the information that I needed as far as the laws according to owning a weapon and having a permit to carry. And it stated if basically I was excluded from having to worry about this information. I was able to purchase a weapon. I was able to get my firearms carry permit as well, right, according to all of this information, according to the laws. Well, I sent it back several times. Now, this was in York County. I sent it back several times, and each time they told me that I cannot get a carry permit because I have a DUI. Now, what do I need to do? Since then, I've moved out of that county. I now live in Adams County, but since then, I haven't gotten a license again, a license to carry. But I have purchased several weapons, so there's no problem with me purchasing a weapon. But yet they're telling me I can't have a permit to carry.
Now, was it a
that.
first offense DUI?
First offense DUI under the old law.
And you got ARD for it?
Yes, I did.
So it should be expunged.
Right. It was expunged. But they, even after everything was expunged, I even took them the paperwork and showed them that it was expunged and everything. They still told me no, I could not.
Well, that's incorrect, I would think. And most importantly, you had a right to, if you filed the application and they reject you, you have a right to have a judge review it.
Okay.
But in Adams County, you can file from scratch with a new sheriff.
Right. That's what I have planned on doing. But like I said, then I have moved since then, so that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make sure that I knew I was legit in being able to get a.
A DUI that went ARD is not going to affect you. A DUI that you were convicted of, a first offense DUI, is not going to affect your gun rights at all.
Right.
And one that you get ARD for, absolutely not. A second offense DUI with a BAC of .16 or greater, and you will lose your gun rights for life.
Right.
That's absolute. So all those guys out there with a second offense DUI who think you're just going to plead guilty and do your time, but you like to take your kids hunting, you better think again. Anyhow, Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Carl.
All right, take care. 540-0580. Doug, you're on the air.
Hey, Carl, I got a landlord-tenant thing going on now for a couple of years.
Okay.
It's too small for any lawyer, and I thought it was over, and then all of a sudden I get this letter from the court saying, do you intend to move forward, or a notice to proceed?
Right. That basically means nobody's done anything with the case in a long time.
Right. And I was like, whoa. But let me give you a quick history here. DJ gave me a judgment for $1,000 on the rent. And I would have took that and walked away. But then when I walked in there, I saw, oops, boy, he did about $1,000 worth of damage. He knocks holes in the wall. So then what I did is when I put, and I was going to walk away. And so I went down to court. I filed my complaint a couple years ago.
Right.
Now, of course, the person moved out the property, so the mail is coming to the property, and he had no forwarding address, so, of course, I send it back and so forth. And then I get the notice to move forward from the court, or they're going to drop it. I figured, okay, well, let me just see how to do this. So I went and asked the court, basically, that I'd like to move forward with this. Mm-hmm. And I thought that they were going to say, well, the statute of limitations ran out. You're not going to be able to move forward with it. And then I actually get a thing from the judge saying, oh, you can move forward with it, but you got to serve the person.
Right.
Do I get now the complaint, do I serve that, have to serve it with, to pay the sheriff to serve it, or can I just send it certified mail since he's been to the DJ and he hasn't responded to anything?
If you're appealing it from the DJ level, you don't need the sheriff.
Okay.
You would use the there's a standard return. It's return receipt requested.
Okay.
And it's on the appellate form, actually, as to what you need to do.
Well, now, the complaint had been filed 2 years ago,
mm-hmm.
and it had just been sitting there. And so I basically just send that certified mail and get the receipt.
Right.
Okay. But now here's the thing. The person doesn't live there. It's going to come back. He doesn't live there.
So now you're stuck. You got to find him and get him physically served. And if he's in state, you have to use the sheriff for that type of action.
Okay.
If he's out of state, you can use a private process server.
Okay. All right, but basically, I'm going to go ahead and walk away from this because it sounds like more
hassle and blood and stones and turnips. There's a whole story about those things.
Yes, and if we're, for that, I need the money, but the person, I don't even know where they are, where they're working. They could even be dead at this point.
Right.
All right, well, thank you very much, Carl.
All right, my friend.
Mm-hmm.
Bye. 540-0580. Kevin, you're on the air.
Carl, good morning. How you doing?
Good.
I had a question about concealed carry. Now, I understand, like, when you're transporting because I go to Palmyra Sportsman Club, and when I transport my firearms, I have them separated, one in the trunk, one in the front. Now, concealing the open carry law, if you're walking down the street with your gun on the outside of your person, can you have it loaded, or must it be unloaded?
In Pennsylvania, you can open carry, which just means we don't have a law against it. Let's explain it that way. We don't have a law per se against it, and if you carry it open and loaded, which is I would never carry an unloaded gun exposed because you're asking for trouble.
Right.
But a loaded gun exposed, a lot of people think is not a good idea. Some people think it's fine to carry. But if you were to, say, walk into a crowded shopping mall, you may be arrested on the theory that you're creating...
Or gun-free zones for school zones. But if you were just walking down the street, you can have it loaded on the outside of your body.
You can, and police officers have arrested people for it and charged them with disorderly conduct. The problem is nobody wants to know the answer. So if you take a hearing, they will usually then dismiss the charge, but they use the charge to... because they don't want to lose it. If they lose it in court and they find out they can't arrest you for disorderly conduct... then
everybody start doing it.
Right. And more importantly, if they ever tried to arrest anybody for it again, then it would be a clear violation of your constitutional rights and you'd be able to sue them. So as a result, anybody out there, whoever knows somebody who does open carries and gets a disorderly conduct citation of any sort, never plead guilty. Just fight it and you will win.
Okay.
Because they will drop it.
All right. All right, thanks.
All right, my friend. Let's see. Sean, what's going on?
Yeah, I just have a statement for you. This happened to me before, and I just wanted to have your take on it, please.
Yeah.
I was driving through Dolphin there by the Hardys, and a police officer commonly sits there at the gas station across the way. I drove past, and he ran my plate, and I'm on 322 heading back to Perry County. With a police officer, the state trooper, came flying up, actually passed me, and he was actually looking for me. Slammed on his brakes in the passing lane, came back, came behind me, pulled me over. And he came up to the car, obviously, in the way they do. Do you know why I pulled you over? I said, no, officer, I don't. I said, I did see you sitting down there at the gas station. And he goes, well, I ran your plate, and it came back to a person that does not have a driver's license. I said, well, the car is registered, it's inspected, and it's insured.
Right.
And he goes, well, basically I admitted to him, I'm driving without a driver's license. I'm not driving under suspension. I think PennDOT is the big bureaucracy. I think there's so much money going through and in and out of the state through that bureaucracy that I refuse to participate anymore. So the officer said, well, I'm going to go ahead and write you up for driving without a license, but I'm going to let you drive away.
Right.
Then he said, well, I could make this all go away if I know anything about anything.
And what he's basically saying is, if you got me you can help me get a drug dealer or some crime or solve a robbery or something, we'll just pretend it never happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, when we get back from the break, I'll give you my take on it, all right? Hold on. 540-0580. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here, 540-0580. Remember, in a few minutes, I'm going to have David Goss here for the 2 o'clock hour, forensic accountant. We're going to talk about how lawyers and businesses can use them. They come up, obviously, in criminal cases, also in civil cases, though. And I think one of the things you'll find that we'll talk about involves small businesses and valuations of business and figuring out where the money really goes and what the flows are, for instance, between people that are splitting up. Or in divorces even, where there's questions about where the cash actually goes. I'm just thinking of the restaurant business, for instance. Sean, we're back here. So anyhow, the long and short of it was he pulled you over because he could tell that the car was registered to somebody who had an expired license, right?
That's correct.
And that was you?
Yes, sir.
And then he basically hassled you and said, but if you can offer me up somebody else on a silver platter, all your problems can go away.
Right, and I basically told him, look, I live up in Perry County. I have a lot of land. I don't like going out in the first place. And every time I do, I run into you. So he said, I'm just going to write you up for not having a driver's license. Just no loss of license. I said, I don't care about losing my license. I don't want it in the first place. And then he goes,
Sean, I got to stop you for a minute. If you're going to be driving on 322, you got to worry about having a driver's license.
Well, no. See, the thing is I had my vehicle registered, inspected, and insured. Okay? I was doing all the right things.
Except
as far as driving a vehicle, except for having a license in this state.
Right. And that's a kind of a minor requirement. I just want to remind you of that.
Well, I understand that, but with the feeling I have towards PennDOT and also some other things that happen in the states, I have my own reasons, but I'm not going to get into that right now.
That's okay. You're a conscientious objector to driver's licenses. I understand. So anyhow, my general take on it, though, is that everybody should keep in mind that they now actually have on some state police cars, and I'm sure some townships will have them soon, OCR, optical character recognition devices, which use a camera to read license plates as the officer drives down the street. And so people without licenses are going to find that if their name is associated with a vehicle in any way, shape, or form, they're going to get caught more and more often because no longer is the officer even going to have to pay attention to the license plates in front of him. The laptop's just going to beep and say, there's a car that has a driver who's unlicensed as an owner. And then the JNet photo will pop up, and the officer will pull up alongside and look over and go, blonde hair, blue eyes. Yep, okay. That's enough to pull you over. And then they look for then whoever's in the car is going to have to cough up a driver's license. So get used to, if you drive on the roads without a license, get used to being pulled up more and more frequently. We've seen it quite a bit lately. So that's my take, brother.
Well, then the officer let me drive away.
Yeah.
So I mean, what kind of sense is that?
Well, I guess he could have put you in shackles and carried you off, but practically, he said He said basically in his head, I don't think Sean's going to kill anybody. I don't think he's really up to anything too nefarious, so I'm going to basically hassle him, probably write him up, and then I'm going to send him on his way because I don't feel like kicking back here and waiting for a tow come to pick up the car and then transporting him. So he was exercising his discretion to the benefit of the people of the Commonwealth and actually to your benefit.
Okay, so I had no recourse whatsoever except for what I did was paid the $110 fine.
Yep. Got to have a license, brother. 540-0580. Tam, you're on the air.
Yes, Carl. I'd like to know if, and if not, why not, in a child molestation case, when a child, or in this case, a group of children accuse a person of molesting them, and a videotaped interview is done with each individual child, why that cannot be used at the preliminary hearing or to help prosecute them.
Well, videotapes are out-of-court statements, so they're hearsay, okay?
Well, what if the child's sitting there to say, yes, that's me, and yes, that's what I said?
Then it's possible to bring it in under certain exceptions. And there's one called the tender years exception.
What's the tender years?
Oh, the tender years exception. It's the name of a statute.
Well, I mean, what age do they?
It's not a specific age. It's just for young kids.
Well, we're talking 6-year-olds.
Yeah, well, they would clearly fall into the 10 years. Slow down for a second and listen to me.
Okay.
All right? So that would be one way that they can get in at trial. At a preliminary hearing, there's no right of the defendant to discovery. So if the government doesn't want to hand the videotapes over to the defendant, he or she has no use of them at the preliminary hearing, okay? The prosecutor, on the other hand, may be able to bring them in, but they also have to file a tender years exception at that level and get a ruling on it. So long and short of it is it's easier to use the kid than it is to use the videotape. But the problem with it is if a 6-year-old, you're probably not going to get what you need on the stand. So they will do, and I haven't participated in tender years hearings at the preliminary hearing level to get a videotape or to bring in the person who was present when the video was done usually, simply to say not the videotape but what the child said on video and get the video later.
Well, the part of the problem is that the child molester was able to prolong the preliminary hearing to the point where the children, the questions they're asked is so vague that, all but one of the children weren't connecting the dots.
Right. Well, we have to be careful about leading, and particularly with kids, it's been shown that leading questions can result in false answers. So a good questioner in child abuse cases has to be very, very careful that they're not participating in tainting the child's testimony by asking leading questions.
Well, that's why I don't understand why they don't just use because...
But they probably could have. Maybe you just had a dumb prosecutor.
Well, I believe that might be the case.
I mean, and the reason I'm not saying that they're all dumb. In fact, most of them are pretty smart. But I have been in hearings before where the prosecutor can't get something into evidence, and I'm going, why don't you just use rule number, whatever in the back of my head or lay the foundation this way? But I'm not going to help them, right?
To tell you the truth, the whole process was horrific. I mean, the preliminary hearing, what they put especially the one little girl through, and then the outcome in the paper and on TV makes it sound like they're innocent, and these mean, evil people are just accusing them falsely.
Well, and I don't know the particulars of this case, but what I'll tell you is this. It's horrific anytime a kid who's been abused has to come back to court and relive it, okay? It's also horrific anytime somebody comes into court and lies or says something inaccurate and somebody goes to jail. And
I agree.
Unfortunately, we have to figure out how to process that out. And our system is designed to use an adversarial system, which is a little messy and a little hurtful to everybody involved, but tries to get to the truth. But keep in mind that 300 people have been freed from life and death sentences for murders under the Innocence Project. And keep in mind that there are probably thousands of innocent people in jail. But also keep in mind that there are many, many guilty people who are just full-blown narcissists, for instance, who will take a trial for another purpose but to be the center of attention. And they don't care who they re-victimize. So it's not going to be pretty any way you look at it, okay?
Well, as an adult involved in this with a grandchild involved, when your child or grandchild says, this person has this vibrating thing and he touches and tickles me with it, and it's our secret, and she points to her crotch.
Well, I understand that's very, very terrible. On the other hand, I felt really bad for the father as I cross-examined his daughter in court not too long ago. She described what my client tried to rape her. Of course, we later proved it was false, and she's now being convicted in juvenile court of perjury. So while I felt really bad for her dad at the moment, now I feel really bad for her dad again for a very different reason. I got to let you go. Here's the end of the show. So when we come back, David Goss is going to be on. We're going to talk about forensic accounting, the law, business. So it's 540-0580. Of course, you want to post a question on Facebook, feel free and fire it up there as well. See you guys in a few minutes.
Advice given is for general information purposes. All legal cases are different, and you should seek the advice of your own attorney before acting or making decisions. No attorney-client privilege applies to communications on this show, and no attorney-client relationship is created by calling or writing in. Attorney Rominger practices only in Pennsylvania and maintains his primary office in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Well, welcome back to the second hour weekend appointment. Carl Rominger here answering your legal questions. I'm joined today by David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting, and he's going to talk to us about white-collar crime, civil cases, kind of the role. David, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Well, first of all, you're a CPA, a CFF, a CGMA, a CIA, and a CFE. What is all that?
The CPA is a Certified Public Accountant.
Okay, we know what that is.
The CFF is Certified in Financial Forensics.
Okay.
CGMA is Chartered Global Management Accountant. CIA is not the one with the dark glasses. It's a certified internal auditor.
Okay.
And then certified fraud examiner.
God, I think I knew CFE. I gave a talk one time. They wanted a lawyer to come in and talk about dealing with dirty people, and it was all investigators and fraud guys. And of course, their shtick is, as I say, their thing is, if they meet somebody who's doing something fraudulent or is disclosing something fraudulent, obviously they take a lot of notes and then disclose it to the right person.
Right.
Whereas as an attorney, if somebody's telling you about all the fraudulent things they did, you take a lot of notes and then you go, okay, well, here's your legal consequences, and you can't destroy evidence, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. But if nobody's charged you yet, then I guess there's nothing for us to do.
Right. Exactly.
And so they were making fun of me because they were fascinated by that. So you work a lot with law firms?
Law firms and businesses. And it can be a large business or it could be a small business.
And just for the listeners' benefit, like a forensic accountant, think of like a typical scenario, and maybe it isn't a typical scenario. Maybe what you're trying to tell me is it usually involves finances, I assume?
Exactly.
And it usually involves products or inventory or the move of money and records and bookkeeping.
Most of the time it involves... it's financial,
okay,
and many times it involves cash.
Okay.
And it can be, something wrong with the bank statement. Basically, an owner, a typical situation would be an owner trips across something. It could be they found some cash in an employee's desk, or their employees acting odd, that they're not quite sure what's happening with that person.
Right.
But they'll get some gut reaction, or maybe they're tracking some financials on some kind of a spreadsheet, and the numbers they're getting back from their bookkeeper, their accountant, just aren't adding up. So they start to get a feel that, I'm trying to grow this business. I think I'm really growing it, but the numbers really aren't supporting that. So as a result, they don't know what to do with it.
Right.
And that's typically, if they really have some good evidence, like in one case, there was a woman who she had downloaded some gambling software on the company's computer. So she was doing online gambling. At the very same time, she bounced a company check for $300,000.
Right.
So immediately the owners thought, she's taking money from us and she's doing the online gambling. So I was called in to, sort that out. And in the end, she was doing online gambling because that's what locked her computer down. But she just wasn't paying attention to moving the money to pay for the bills that were going out.
Okay.
So she really wasn't stealing money. But, when you put those two together, first blush, that's what everybody thought was happening.
It looks bad on the surface, but you have to actually untangle everything to see what really went on.
Right.
It's very interesting. When I first started my law practice and I brought my first partner on, he liked to do all the checks and deposits and everything, which was great. But what happened is, as you grow bigger, so, we're two young lawyers and we have a few clients and we have a few more clients, and all of a sudden you're getting in, instead of 6 or 8 checks a week, now you got 28 checks a week. Now you got 35 checks a week. Also, it's a full-time job just to enter all the accounting on the accounting slips, get it into the computer. We're not even starting paying the bills yet.
Exactly.
So you eventually have to offload it on an employee. So I assume, as you say, as the business grows. So now, of course, when we first started doing it, we were thinking like, well, do we give this person the right to make a deposit? Do we give this person a right to sign a check? And I assume maybe you had kind of mentioned to me when we were talking a little bit during the break that small businesses sometimes lack the controls of bigger businesses.
Exactly. In a typical small business, they can't afford to have extra people just sitting around. And when we have an economy like we're dealing with now, many times people have been laid off, and there's a lot of pressures on some people. And the one thing I always tell businesses, what you can't control is what type of pressures are affecting those people outside of the workplace.
Right.
So if you have someone who is your bookkeeper, and a typical scenario, if I go into a business, they'll tell me that this individual's worked for me for umpteen years, and I trust them with my life. They've always done a good job. We've never had a problem. Well, then, something happens. There's a pressure on that person outside. Maybe that person's house is up for foreclosure, or some medical situation, or a spouse loses their job.
Right.
And all of a sudden that financial pressure makes a person start to think, make bad decisions. And they bring that into the workplace because they start out saying, well, I need money, and maybe I'm just going to borrow the money from my employer without them knowing it, and I'll pay it back. That's a typical scenario. And once they kind of get into the whole realm of taking money, it can turn into a whole greed thing. And I've had one fraudster who said, once I realized how easy it was to steal, I just got greedy.
Right.
And he started spending money and stealing it, and went on for years and years and years.
I had represented a bookkeeper one time years ago, and they had given her the sole responsibility of collecting all the deposits, paying all the checks, signature authority, and then, as the FBI agent said to me, to put the icing on the cake, paid her minimum wage. And we sat down with her because we were going to cooperate. We had, decided that she needed to come forward and cooperate, and that was going to be in her best interest. And he told me before the interview, he said, what you're going to see today is I'm going to ask her how much she took over the last 2 or 3 years, and she's going to give me a number, and it's going to be about anywhere from a fifth to a third or half of what she actually took, but it's not going to be anywhere near the actual amount, because he said quite frequently when people do this where they think they're going to pay it back, they just take a little bit at a time, and they just assume they're going to catch up some point, and it doesn't work out. That's
a very typical scenario.
And sure enough, when he asked her, she said, like maybe 20, 25,000. He said, try 102, over the 3 years.
I had a case where once it was determined that there was something wrong with the books, the individual who was doing the accounting ultimately admitted to taking $125,000. But then he came back to the family business and said, if you don't let this go public, I'll pay you $800,000. And my response was, I believe he stole more than $800,000, because if you only stole 125, why would you pay 800?
Right.
And it turned out I was able to prove 1.7 million.
Okay.
And this is a small family-run business with maybe about 275 employees. They're still operating. They're still struggling with the issues that he's left them with. The individual, we were able to, through the DA, get it prosecuted. He did go to jail, but he's out of jail and back doing what he was doing before.
Yeah, it's always interesting in the arena where you talk to the different people and you say, what did you take or how did you take it? And I guess this guy was very sophisticated. Then he was gonna cop to some and then walk on the rest. Would they have been better off to take the $800,000? That's my interesting question for you.
Well, they're always looking for restitution. Many times, what I have to do is manage their expectation because, they go from a situation where they have a trusted employee who looks like, has taken money from them.
Right.
They don't necessarily know how much that is, but now we have to try to determine, how much they took, over what period of time, and then what's going to happen from here. And so they go from that kind of being dismayed that, they trusted this person for all these years. They could have a family relationship between these individuals. And then you kind of go, now they're mad. Now they're mad that this happened, that it happened on their watch, if it's the president of the company. And they go through those different stages. And then they get to the point where I want this person prosecuted. I want them to go to jail, never to see the light of day. And I want all my money back.
Right.
That doesn't always happen. And sometimes, it all comes down for me that I have to be able to prove that number. I have to be able to prove the method that the money was taken. And when I go to court, I have to testify to that. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean a jury will believe the story.
Right.
So sometimes, it is a roll of the dice when you get into a jury setting, as you well know.
Yeah, we know. I'm talking with David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. When we get back from the break, I know we have some callers on the board here, 540-0580. So, John, you'll be up next with a question for David Goss. See you after the break. Hey, welcome back. Carl Rominger here. If you just joined us, we have David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. We're talking about the law of forensic accounting businesses. We're going to take some callers here. John, you're on with David Goss.
Yeah. I have a question about, you're talking about small companies. I have a question about big companies that get taken to the movies or announce things. A company I have an investment in announced yesterday afternoon, after the market closed, that they're going to take a over $500 million impairment charge because of a multi-year fraud of something they invested in or bought in China. This is a U.S. company on Dow. It's a Dow 500 company, Fortune 500. So, what are your options? Like, they're announcing this obviously at 5:00 Friday before a holiday, so there's not as much impact. But obviously, they're doing this to try to minimize the damage. But the question is, when did they know it, or when did they suspect it, and when did they chose to release this? Is that information too?
Well, there's specific, John. There's specific accounting rules for when a company takes an impairment, and certainly that's a large impairment. Obviously, they got to a point where they had enough information where they had to make that decision, had to book that loss. And in that case, a company of that size, there may be an issue which will eventually pop up to be a class action suit where the investors are now, digging into what happened. I've just lost, my investment or a large part of my investment. And, that obviously will involve a lot of accountants and forensic type people and attorneys for something of that magnitude.
Right, but they chose to announce this at 5:00 on a Friday before the holiday,
and
when they obviously knew this, a couple weeks
John,
ago.
are you accusing them of timing the release of the information to slow down market movement?
Exactly. Not only slow down market movement, but to try to minimize any, before a holiday weekend, et cetera, et cetera.
See, that's why. The reason I said it that way, though, is I wonder, you're going to say they should have disclosed it sooner, so I could have reacted to it, right?
That's right, and obviously,
and they're going to say, well, actually, we helped you out because the dip in our price might have been too great and too unfair. We wanted to give people time to digest it, so we actually chose that to try to protect the stockholders. And I think that's going to become a question of which was the right fiduciary move. But I would think if they'd known about it for a month or 3 and had sufficient information to go public with it, that's going to become the real question. And you're right, though. It's going to be, if I'm arguing that they timed the release and knew about it for a while, it's going to be very helpful to claim that the timing fell on something that was particularly convenient for them. I think I'm thinking about this the right way.
Right. And also, many times when a fraud, if it's a large fraud, once you start looking into it, these things go back many years. I mean, for me, some of the fraud cases I do and have done, go back 4 to 10 years. 4 to 10 years, they're not just something that happened in the last couple of months. So
but this was something they acquired in the last year, and it was a multi-year fraud on the books of the company they acquired.
Right.
So they missed their fiduciary duty in investigating the company properly when they acquired them.
There may be a due diligence issue. Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, that's I think where the forensic accountants are going to dig in, and also where people are going to go back and say, what did you do for due diligence? But I will say, in my experience, due diligence is due diligence, but it's not perfection.
Right.
All right.
And,
all right, John, I'm going to let you go because I got a Madoff question I want to take. All right, 540-0580. Andy, you have a question for David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. Of course, you want to ask about the biggest financial fraud of history, right?
Yeah, essentially this is pretty much the epitome of his field, I guess you could say. My main question was, Bernie Madoff, everyone kind of has a general sense of what happened, but what exactly, I guess, didn't happen? Or, what regulators, what audits, obviously a lot of people were not doing their job. Can he basically explain what really was the scandal and who basically was not doing their job and what exactly happened?
Well, let me put it this way. I do a lot of forensic investigations that are on the heels of working with businesses that have regular audits. And sometimes, like I said, I did a bank investigation out in Kansas. Now, they have regular audits by independent auditors. They have the FDIC, regulatory agency comes in and they audit as well. And, in the midst of all that, there was an employee who was a vice president of the bank who was stealing funds. She started out stealing funds from dormant accounts, and she had full control over the dormant accounts. And then she started stealing a year later. She started stealing from active accounts, generally elderly people, and she knew that the elderly people didn't have, for the most part, online access into their bank accounts. And so she took advantage of that knowledge and the fact that she was vice president. Now, they have, many times in all these situations, when you dig back into it, you can drive it right back to a lack of internal controls. And that's a very broad statement, but, somebody didn't do their job along the way. Somebody didn't ask the right question. And in the case that I took out in Kansas, there was an internal control where each individual was supposed to watch the bank accounts of other bank employees. Now, one woman saw some of these transactions, but she figured, this woman is a vice president. She knows what she's doing. She's in charge of the bookkeeping function. I'm going to trust that she knows what she's doing, so I'm not going to ask the question that I'm supposed to ask. Had she asked that question, we probably could have stopped that fraud in midstream. Instead of it going over 4 years, it might have only occurred at 2. But luckily, in that case, the FDIC, in their sampling, had one transaction, and as soon as they asked her the question about the anomaly that they were seeing in her one transaction, she confessed right away. She was basically waiting for that one right question, and then she confessed, and then I had to come in, and the bank said to me, we want to know exactly what the total amount of the loss is. And then I had to do that investigation. But in a big situation like with Madoff, obviously there's a lot of players, and what I want to say is the trust factor is huge. And I have people that tell me, I met this investment guy, and he's telling me he can get 12 to 15% for me. And, that's setting off a red flag for me. I'm like, in today's market, who's getting 12 to 15%? What kind of an investment is it? Is it too good to be true?
Only the members of Congress get that rate of return on their investments.
So, so again, there's a lot of fault, a lot of fingers that can be pointed to all the players that are involved in a scheme of that magnitude. Luckily, it was uncovered, but, a lot of people were damaged as a result.
I see. How does one question? I mean, how does the money actually get into the people's bank account? I mean, do they falsify checks? I mean, how does logistically? I mean, how does you actually take money from a client's account, and how does it actually end up in their bank account?
Well, in a big institution, there's a lot of money moving a lot of different ways, and sometimes it doesn't always go into their bank account. Sometimes, they can set up a shell company, and I have examples. Even up in Berks County, where we have a situation, a woman stole $1.86 million from her employer over a long period of time. She set up a fake company. She set up fake invoices, and the company dispersed those, paid those invoices. The money went to a P.O. box. She was, it was her P.O. box. The fake company, she was registered with the state that she was president of that company. It all happened internally in a fairly good-sized company with a lot of internal controls. And then, somebody trips across a transaction that just doesn't look right, and then they follow it to its logical conclusion, and next thing you know, you have someone stealing $1.86 million. They go to jail, and then the question is, will they ever see that money back?
Does it tend to happen when one person is responsible for one action in terms of making payments, making invoices? I mean, does it ever? I mean, would having two people or three people oversee something, would that minimize it?
Well, that would certainly help from an internal control standpoint. It might minimize the risk. Certainly in small businesses where you have one bookkeeper, one accountant, a lot of times, you're putting an awful lot of trust in that person. And that doesn't mean the person doesn't justify being trusted, but from an owner's standpoint, it should be trust and verify. Ask questions, learn your financial statements, understand the flow of your business and cash flow. A lot of businesses don't understand, business owners don't understand, the financial statements and how the numbers interact with each other. And as a result, they don't ask the questions. And if they have that concern, maybe they need to get, somebody else in to just help them either understand it or, look into it and just, not every case, turns out to be a fraud.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, Andy. Take care, brother. 540-0580, talking with David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. David, if people wanted to find you, we've got some business owners or lawyers or citizens out here who think they need your services. How do they find you?
Well, they can find me on the web. I have a website, North American Forensic Accounting, or they can find me on Facebook, or they could just, call me directly at 717-466-6800.
Yeah, and I would tell people we'll obviously have your contact information up, and if they were to call in here, Shane will be able to get it for them as well. We're going to talk, I guess, in the next half hour. I want to go into a couple specific cases you've done just to give us some examples. And I also want to talk about how this might work with an attorney and when an attorney would hire you rather than the business, or why be hired through an attorney, and then talk about some of the obligations you may have for disclosure or non-disclosure. Okay?
Yep.
See you guys after the break. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here. I've got David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting with me. And if you want to get in contact with him, we'll make sure you get contact information, or you can just look him up on Facebook. He has a website for North American Forensic Accounting. Are you based locally?
Out of Ephrata.
Ephrata. And so you listen to WHP 580 once in a while.
All the time.
Yeah. I guess, I heard R.J. Harris saying they won the ratings again. So this is the station to be on, apparently. I wanted to talk to you about this. So if I get hired by a client and they want to do an accounting, or there's a forensic issue in their books, obviously I would come and retain you.
Correct.
Now, what are the advantages of, and I think maybe you know the answer, maybe I can answer too, but I'll let you answer. There's certainly an advantage of you being retained through the lawyer versus you being retained directly by the business.
Correct. And that's one of the first questions after I had the initial interview with the client, where they say, well, here's what I think's happening. Here's what I want you to try to find out. Then it's a matter of, working with the attorney. How do we want to set up the engagement? And most of my engagements, an attorney will hire me so that we set up the attorney-client privilege. That way, if I run across some other things, maybe the opposing side, who could be the suspect, and their attorney, maybe they can't get to that information.
Right. And there are certain duties on businesses to disclose, but there's other times when they don't have to disclose something, even if they've realized that something was amiss, and they may make a strategic decision to say, I need to go forward and try to prosecute this guy. I've learned about something else that happened, but I don't appear to have any affirmative duty to mention it, so why would I? We'll just deal with it internally and move on. But if you did it outside the scope of privilege, you might be compelled to testify, or you might even feel that you, as your role with all your licensures, as having a duty to come forward.
Right.
Whereas we attorneys, like I said earlier, don't have to come forward most of the time. What we can't do, though, and it's very tricky sometimes for clients to understand, is we can't help you cover up a crime, and we can't help you, when I say cover up a crime, destroy evidence and do things like that, and we cannot help you commit the crime. So you can't come in and ask me, what's the best, what could I do to make it the hardest to prosecute me if I want to run a drug dealing operation? How should I set up my conspiracy? That means because there is no privilege to a communication for the purposes of committing a fraud or a crime. Although anything about the fraud or the crime in the past is 100% privileged. So yeah, I think that would be. So I would assume if a business owner contacts you, gives you the skinny, you say, "Do you have an attorney?" He says, "No, I don't." You would say, "Go get an attorney."
Exactly. And
then have the attorney engage me. And I'm sure if the attorney's a neophyte to this sort of thing, you can sort of fill them in on what they need to do.
Many times the attorney will, come right out and say, first of all, I want to let you know, I'm not the accountant. I'm a lawyer, so, you do your thing and I do my thing. But we work together in many of these cases very closely.
I think the question I also want to ask you is, so if I hire you for a client and we do learn about, we'll go with the father-son thing, and we determine that the son is stealing and we get an amount, because it's in the scope of privilege, I assume then that since you don't have to tell anybody, the father would have that option of going to the son and saying, do you still have the money? And if you do, we're just going to end it here today and we'll call it a civil restitution and we won't go any further.
Exactly.
Whereas if it was done outside the scope of privilege, then there's always the danger that you would have to divulge what you've learned, and then the son's going to be prosecuted anyhow.
Exactly. But most of the time, when I do a report, it's going to the attorney, to the client. Here's what I've done. Here's what I found. Here's what I can prove. And then it's a decision as to what are we going to do? What's the next step?
Right. Then they make that internally, and they do it with the auspice of the attorney-client privilege. So, and that's an important thing to keep in the back of your head, folks, if you're hiring an expert of any sort for litigation. In fact, I've had people, and I'll tell you a funny thing. So I asked a woman who does a lot of commercial litigation involving tractor trailers and things that get in accidents about what she thought about keeping cameras in the truck so the guys can take pictures on the scene. And she said the problem is they tend to take the worst pictures because they take all the things we really don't want to emphasize, the blood and the gore and all that. And then also there's a question of it's not work product. There's no protection for it. There's no ability to hold it back whatsoever. Whereas if we immediately engage an investigator by the attorney and have them go out and do some things, the photographs may be eventually discoverable, but a lot of the other impressions and things are going to be work product, so we don't have to turn that over. So we don't want the client trucking company engaging their PIs. We don't want them taking their own photographs. We want them to do everything through us. And I think that stands true of any kind of expert because it leaves more options open. So I just want to remind everybody, if you think you need to hire a PI for your small business because you want to trail an employee and figure something out, maybe it's not book fraud you're looking for, you just want to see where he's delivering the goods to or something, it's always better to get the attorney involved in the first instance and then engage these services through the attorney because it creates a whole other layer of protection that may give you more flexibility later. Give us an example of a case, or like another example of a case you've been through, and kind of how the fraud was discovered and what it was. I think people find this very fascinating.
I had a case where the individual was an owner of a small insurance company, and interesting enough, many people will come to the door and will pay their premiums in cash, particularly elderly people, because they're used to dealing in cash. They had a bookkeeper who was there for a short period of time, and she was preparing financial statements, and the owner had a sense. He was kind of tracking information on the premiums and the kind of revenue that he expected from the business. And one of the financial statements, when it was delivered to him, he started to notice a pattern, and many times we're looking for patterns in what I do. He noticed that, the numbers were short by about $20,000, almost $20,000 even. And he confronted the bookkeeper, and then later that afternoon, the bookkeeper came back, revamped the financial statements, added exactly $20,000, and, at that point he knew something wasn't right. And she walked out the door, and eventually I got engaged, and we found a lot of different things throughout that investigation. But it took a lot of work because she had really destroyed the accounting records. A lot of transactions were deleted and things like that. So it took a lot of time to connect the dots. And then then the question is, right, what are we going to do? And that was a relatively small, what I'll call a relatively small embezzlement. But the impact to the business was huge. And in the end, that individual lost his business that he had been working, his entire life for. And there's still some parts of that are in litigation out there.
Now, and I read an article recently, so you can stop me if it's not something, but it had to do with statistical analysis of just the very numbers themselves, and the idea that if you're just collecting normal business data over time, the numbers should have like a certain frequency of digits in them and whatnot. And if things are there's too many of certain, when people start to create fraudulent transactions, it's no longer random anymore because they're doing something to manipulate it and changes the data frequency. So you can't just find the fraud with it, but if you do an analysis of the digits that are used, you can somehow say, like, there seems to be fraud in the Iranian election results, or there seems to be fraud in the just because the numbers, and I think it's Bedford's law, or I'm trying to remember the mathematics, but I read an article about it.
Well, that gets into some of the situations where there's a high volume of transactions, and then you can use some software to try to pull out the anomalies that, sequences of numbers, the size of the numbers, things like that, where you can use some software and you apply it to the data, which is not necessarily easy to do. Sometimes you need to have an IT, computer-type forensic person do that data mining for you or with you to extract some of that information. You still have to then look at it from an analytical standpoint and analyze the data. And it doesn't make sense. What I'm looking at, is this fraud or is it sloppy bookkeeping? And that's a question I get a lot, especially in the small businesses. Is it sloppy bookkeeping, or is there really something happening here? We had a case years ago where I just out of law school, I worked for another lawyer, and there was another lawyer who had believed that their bookkeeper had stolen from them. But that's kind of what happened when we got into the, show us the books and start looking at the cash receipts and how the records were kept. It was so poor, and it was so unclear as to where, if somebody had brought $500 payment in, you would have a really hard time figuring out when they brought it in, whether it was credited to a bill or not, where it was deposited, et cetera, to the point where our position was, even if the bookkeeper was stealing, you couldn't prove it because there's just no records of anything. And if you were the lawyer, you should have at least maybe a year ago gone, well, I don't have any records of anything. Right. But some, like particularly in an elder fraud case, you had mentioned earlier, some of these cases don't always go to court. Right. Elder fraud case, which I'm particularly passionate about, it's a situation where, a relative or a caregiver, is taking advantage of an elderly person. And there's a lot of reasons that happens. The elderly person is very trusting. But in many of those cases, they don't go to court. And sometimes they don't get investigated because if there's other siblings involved or other relatives involved, they may not have the funds to launch the investigation. So right. It's really sad when you see those situations where someone's been taken advantage of and they just don't have the wherewithal to, pay for the investigation. Well, another lawyer had asked me not too long ago. She said, I have a case, and the family thinks that,
executor who was the power of attorney before this ran off with money. But you look at the bank statement, and it doesn't look like they ran off with any money. But then she's like, well, maybe she had a different banking account. Well, how do you figure out? And I said, that's a problem, right? I mean, you got to start from the proposition of, I mean, these days especially, people could be banking in a bank online from anywhere. But even with an older person, you know, did they have an account in the Bank of Landisburg, or was it with PNC? And then you start listing all the different banks, and I'm like, the only way I know to figure that out is to send a subpoena out, open up a case. So you got to file it, get a case going, send subpoenas for records to all the different banks, and get a letter back saying, never heard of this person, never heard of this person, never heard of this person. And even then, you can't do it exhaustively.
And sometimes, you know, the information, the evidence you're looking for could be something like that, just written on a piece of paper, that leads you to say, well, what's the involvement, or why is this bank listed here?
Right.
You know, and then you do have to get. That's where I work closely with attorneys, because then we have to decide. You know, are we going to go out for subpoenas? You know, and that takes a long time sometimes to get the information back.
I got to go to break, talking with David Goss of North American Forensic Accounting. When we come back, we'll take some more questions. David, if they want to find you again, you have a website or a phone number?
Yes. North American Forensics, if you look on the website, phone number 717-466-6800.
Thanks. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here with David Goss, North American Forensic Accounting. We're talking about forensic accounting, the law. Of course, we've been talking about some cases. 540-0580 if you have any calls or you want to talk about anything, 540-0580. I guess and we have a lot of small business listeners, you know, and when I say small business, I don't mean the federal definition of small business. You know, I mean there's 4 guys and a lift or a pallet factory, or so, you know, just small, maybe 10 employees. What should they be doing? I mean, what are some simple steps that they could take to protect themselves from fraud by employees? I mean, some common sense steps, and what should they be looking for just to make sure it's not going on?
Well, one thing they should do is, you know, ask questions about the accounting. If they don't understand, you know, the financial statements that are being prepared, or the numbers just don't seem to make sense relative to their understanding of how the business is growing or not growing, you know, then they need to, you know, peer into that, ask questions, you know, go to the bookkeeper and say, you know, maybe look at some transactions, or even better yet, you know, get the bank statements and get copies of the checks and just look through the checks. Now, that's a problem right now with, you know, most businesses don't get copies of their checks back like we used to. You know, we don't get the physical checks, and, you know, a lot of businesses don't want to pay the $2 per month to actually be able to see the little pictures of the checks, in which case most of the time you need a magnifying glass to read it anyway. Then you have the problem that, you know, even if they get the front of the checks, they don't always get the back of the checks, and sometimes you can find someone endorsed a check, altered a check, and then there's a second endorsement. That could, you know, lead you to suspect, well, why did that happen?
Right.
And I've done cases where, you know, vendors called in and say, why did somebody alter my check? You know, the check was made out to the organization, an employee inside the organization crossed the name of the organization out, wrote her name on top of it, cashed the check. Now, if he didn't get those pictures back with his bank statement, he would have never known that, and we would have never been able to break that case.
It's interesting. You know, I had been told too that there's different ways to structure your account. So I've heard people say, for instance, you can have an account where the employees can deposit into it, but they can't write out of it, and then you give them a different account to write the checks out of, so they can't just, you know, drain the account one day. I mean, are those common sense tips? Or?
Sure. And one of the things that you'll hear, you know, from time to time, we'll have dual signatures on accounts. Unfortunately, I've worked cases where there were dual signatures required, but the scheme was sophisticated enough where the bookkeeper was able to go in and get the check stock and was able to use the computer, and this is becoming more of a problem with the electronics we have and the technology. She was able to lift those signatures and put them on a real check. So she was making checks out to herself, and those signatures were exactly the signatures of the two individuals that, you know, the control was there,
right?
But she knew how to get beyond the control.
That's very interesting. I've seen too that now, for instance, travelers' checks aren't being accepted in a lot of places because they're too easy to make fraudulent ones, and so they're being less and less prevalently used. And we see with the banks all the time. We've had a lot of clients over the years get themselves in some trouble where they get one of these checks in the mail, apparently from a business. They're supposed to cash it, wire some money, and some kind of scheme. But apparently the checks are that good that you can't, as a banker, just run them through a fraud, general, check the paper, do the thing. They're real checks.
Right. And I get asked that a lot. Like, why didn't the bank find this fraud? Well, I tell people banks are processing millions of transactions. And those transactions are becoming electronic. There's no one sitting at the bank looking at the check you wrote and trying to determine, is that a fraudulent signature or is there something about that that's not right? That's just it's not happening. It's not even.
I also imagine that there's an issue because the bank doesn't really know how you run your business. And you could have 3 auto parts stores, 3 mechanics, 10 lawyers, 20 beauty shops. And if you went between each class of business, you'd find that each person has a different way of writing their books, different frequency of paying their bills, different ways of paying their employees, different frequency of taking petty cash out, and that you couldn't just look at a series of transactions and know that it was funny without really knowing more about how the business runs on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. And I've seen cases where the banker, once a fraud has been discovered, and we kind of get into the case, the banker's starting to ask the questions, and I'm not saying across the board here for as far as bankers go, but the banker's starting to ask questions. Well, tell me more about your business. They should have asked that question when that customer became a customer of theirs.
So they understand what they're doing.
Right. Because they're receiving many times, if there's loans involved, they're receiving financial statements. They need to ask questions about those financial statements or those tax returns. And many times you have differences between what's shown on the tax return and what's on the books because of accounting,
Well, I've always told people, watch in some restaurants, and you'll notice that they don't close the cash register drawer between transactions so that they can scoop cash out at the end of the night. And that might be a business owner who's stealing from himself for tax purposes or tax evasion purposes.
Well, there's a lot of businesses like restaurants that are particularly vulnerable to that because there's a lot of cash still moving.
And that's probably, again, an area where because we've talked about the fraud where an employee is sort of writing checks or doing something, but where the cash is up front, you can underring or overring. I guess you never want to overring, but you can underring items so that you collect $12 from the customer and put $8 in the register. And I've seen these point of sale systems that are designed to help prevent that, but those cost money. And again, some of the smaller restaurants don't employ them.
Right.
Have you had any good restaurant cases?
I've had a couple of restaurant cases, and they are particularly difficult, again, because of the cash element. If you get a situation where someone's skimming, which is the money's being taken before it ever gets into the books, you can do all the tracing you want in the records. You're not going to find the cash. Then you have to look at, other, relative to maybe prior years, things like that, where you're trying to understand why the numbers are changing the way they are. But cash is still, a very difficult thing to trace.
How about in divorces? Have you ever been brought in to do a forensic accounting in a divorce case?
I have a number of cases right now, and they typically will have one spouse will be the owner of a business, and the complaint by the other spouse is there's something that's happening with that business where the business is being shown to be less valuable than it really is. They're commingling funds, they're running personal expenses through the business, and that makes it look like it's less profitable and things like that. That happens all the time. I have a few cases right now I'm working with.
And I know that is the recrimination that comes up, and of course, sometimes I think it's true, and sometimes it's just wishful thinking. We always have a joke that when people get divorced, they want there to be more than there was when they were married. And they forget that sometimes. But I do know we've had I was involved in a case, and it was a restaurant, and then, of course, you have the generations own it. So you've got, like, grandma and grandpa and son own it. Ex-wife, of course, is positive. But then when you have multiple owners and pay structures, then it's almost impossible,
Well, I had one restaurant case where the concern was that an external individual, external to the business, was taking money from them. And when I dug into it, the problem was the cash, because as they collect cash throughout the day, they don't deposit that in its entirety. They'll take some of that cash and then they'll go buy more groceries. So you really didn't have a good trace of, the cash register said you collected this much money, but you never put that in the bank. So I don't have a match for that. And then you say, well, now I paid for purchases. And when you try to net that out, numbers just don't hang together for you.
I had a case one time where the one business partner absconded with a bag of cash, and the other business partner wanted to sue him and wind down the business. But I say, why did you have, $30,000 in a bag of cash? And, of course, I think the answer was they didn't want to deposit it in a bank. I got to let you go. David Goss, North American Forensic Accounting, if you want to find him. And thank you for being on the show.
Sure.
466-6800. Is that the right number? And naforensics.com. Guys, if you have any questions for him, hit him up, because if you have a small business, this is the kind of person you want to get if you think there's any money disappearing. Talk to you later. I'll be back next week.
Thank you.